Historically, Star Wars tabletop role-playing games have played a massive role in establishing Star Wars lore. When the Thrawn trilogy and other novels started being written in the 90s, really kicking off what we think of as the core of the expanded universe today, the common reference point all of those books used were the original TTRPG source books by West End Games. These kinds of source books were really the first areas focused on fleshing out the Star Wars universe as a setting, beyond what was immediately necessary for a story like what you'd see in a movie or a show, giving game masters and their players plenty of threads to pick up for their own adventures, and greatly expanding the roster of ships and organizations or anything else that players could interact with. As Star Wars publishing began to get a greater idea of there being a benefit to having one consistent through line in the stories being told and one consistent set of ideas, characters, ships, and so on, the tabletop games were a big part of that foundation, at least compared to, say, the Marvel comics which had started coming out during the original trilogy's run in cinema. Elements from them did start getting worked in later on, but it was much later on, and it wasn't something that the original books were too concerned about being consistent with. But when he began writing the Thrawn trilogy, Timothy Zahn was sent a box of tabletop source books for him to reference and pull from. For example, the Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser, which almost every fan may recognize now given its prominence throughout Legends media, including its massive role in the Thrawn trilogy as part of the Katana fleet, and then its reintroduction to canon in Rebels in a modified form, was originally introduced by the Imperial Sourcebook in 1989. For a more recent example, the Imperial Security Bureau, or ISB, which played a massive role in Andor after a long time getting entrenched as one of the worst Imperial government branches in written works, also originated in the tabletop games all the way back in 1987. I did a video a long time ago talking about what the practical meaning of canon really is, and one of the core elements I pointed to is the likelihood of that work getting referenced and used heavily in future works. And that's something that's clearly a strong point for the West End Games era of tabletop RPGs. There are three major eras in Star Wars tabletop game publishing though, divided by publisher, and the role they play kind of shifts over time from being something that introduces all of this stuff for books to pull from, to being something that takes information from the books and then kind of adds in background. First was the West End Games era, published from 1987 to 1998. This period was heavily focused on fleshing out the Rebels and Galactic Empire, given the fact that only the original trilogy existed, and going into another era wouldn't be particularly feasible. Where it does try to talk about the past, the lack of the prequels means a lot of its information would conflict in various ways with what would come later. But it did also put a lot of effort into fleshing out locations and species. Later on, as the novels started to release, the timeline for the West End Games coverage went forward a little bit as well. It went from being the foundation upon which the books were written into being something that would take the novels and would add extra context around them. There were companion source books for things like the Thrawn trilogy and Truce at Bakura released under West End Games, and that's something that would continue in the next era, published by Wizards of the Coast from 1999 to 2010. This era as a whole was a lot more similar to the end of the West End Games era, where there was a much bigger focus on releasing these kind of companion books to the primary narrative novels that were coming out. And it wasn't just novels, there was also some reference to games and comics. The Knights of the Old Republic game and comics got a tie-in, as did the New Jedi Order novel series and the Legacy comics. I'll always be kind of sad that Legacy of the Force never got one, since these source books tended to be one of the best chances we had to see visual depictions of ships only ever mentioned in the novels. So the Legacy of the Force era is like this trove of ship classes that never got official depictions. The other best chance for that kind of thing started to come with the Essential Guides and other similar books, which basically took the premise of expanding the background of the galaxy for lore nerds, but without the context of being made for a role-playing game. They started releasing in the 90s, but at that point they were typically just about content from the movies and a little bit of additional information. But over time, as we got to things like the Essential Atlas and the Essential Guide to Warfare, you started to see a lot more that got fleshed out from the novels, rather than just giving extra background details about things in the movies. But finally, we have the third era, and kind of our main topic for the day, the Fantasy Flight Games era. Fantasy Flight Games picked up the license in 2012, and they still hold it to this day, although it's been a few years since they've published any tabletop books, despite the creation of a studio specifically focused on an Edge Studio in 2023. They also use the license for miniature wargaming, with games like Armada, X-Wing, and Legion. Mechanically, the rule set published by Fantasy Flight Games, starting with their first title, Edge of the Empire, which then got expanded to Age of Rebellion and Forces of Destiny, is actually my favorite to play compared to the D20 and D6 games that came with the earlier eras. I've even streamed a few campaigns. The narrative dice system that they use can really make it easy for even new players to figure out how to react to things, but lore-wise, which is what we really care about right now, not how much fun I have doing other stuff, they end up in the weirdest spot. You'll notice something important about the date starting in 2012 and going to now. They got the license in 2012 and began publishing in 2013 with the core rulebook for Edge of the Empire, consistently releasing additional books since then, whether they're additional rulebooks, setting guides, adventure guides, etc. But in April 2014, we had the announcement that the expanded universe content that existed already was being rebranded to Legends, and a new expanded universe was going to be spun up. Edge of the Empire content was already being put out though, and then Age of Rebellion started publishing in July 2014, only 2 months after the Legends reboot. And then Force and Destiny came out in 2015, and you could like this video or subscribe for more in 2015 or any year after. The FFG sourcebooks aren't unique in coming out around this time. There were some Legends novels being written at the time which simply got transported into canon once they were published, like Heir to the Jedi. But there were also some novels like the Sword of the Jedi trilogy, which just got completely scrapped. Typically, the line here was if it was about something that went on the original trilogy, that could come over. If it was something that was based on the years of development after Endor, that wasn't going to align with why they were rebooting the universe. But for Fantasy Flight Games, given the breadth and depth needed for a good RPG setting, this meant a wide assortment of what was introduced had been built on the pre-existing history of Legends content. Their sourcebooks focused on the Galactic Civil War and then the prequel eras, given that the sequels were still coming out. But we had a strange situation where they first began as entirely Legends-based, and then as canon material started filtering out, more canon work started filtering in. The result is that we have a situation where there's no hard line where we can say things either apply in Legends or to canon. So there's a lot of content from new canon which may be workable into a Legends context with these books, and then a lot of Legends content which gets worked into canon from this. For instance, the Lead by Example sourcebook came out in 2015, so it's still pretty heavily working off of Legends content, even though the Legends timeline had been split off for a year. Thanks to this, ships like the sadly never officially pictured Maelstrom, which originated in a Wizards of the Coast sourcebook, was brought forward into canon despite being one of the most obscure ships in Star Wars history. The Assertor-class Star Dreadnought similarly was brought forward after its introduction in the Essential Guide to Warfare. The lore blurbs for these ships and other content also reference some of the origins of those vessels from Legends. For example, the Adventure module, which originally introduced the Maelstrom in the Wizards of the Coast era, gets referenced in Lead by Example, bringing not just the Maelstrom itself, but also a Jedi named Darius Jet into canon. Sticking with just Lead by Example, which I did in fact choose because its name has example in it, the Bellator gets brought forward as well, but we also get the Active and Surveyor, which are introduced in Lead by Example, so they're ambiguously part of either, both, or neither continuity because they only ever get mentioned here and it's so unclear where that falls. By the time of the most recent books like Rise of the Separatists and Collapse of the Republic, there's a much more explicit attempt to align with newer canon material, given that canon had finally had time to separate its identity a bit and actually release content for them to reference. But there's still plenty of Legends content which gets brought forward, like the CIS shipyard world of Mintuine, the Wookiee colony world of Alaris Prime from Galactic Battlegrounds, and the Locke Revenant pirate group. Compare this to the Old Republic MMO, where it was released during Legends, but while it continues to get updates and new content, it remains pretty firmly fixed into Legends and not part of the newer continuity. But this highlights something important that I think people like me, who are more focused on the idea of Star Wars as primarily existing to be one big consistent set of lore, need to keep in mind. This may be something that has gained importance within the minds of the publishers of Star Wars media since the 90s, but even with that gained importance, it is a secondary consideration. Aside from the real first consideration of this exists to make money as far as publishers and corporations are concerned, once you get to the people actually making the piece of media or deciding this kind of story element, the first consideration is always going to be what the specific purpose of that media is. The tabletop RPGs may have always had this focus on fleshing out the background lore of the universe, but that was done with the intent of setting up a universe that game masters could set their adventures in and players could play around in with as many options and interesting possibilities as they could manage. They are not doing this to create a fleshed out Star Wars universe with its consistent history for its own sake. The creators of the Fantasy Flight Games rulebook and supplements clearly did a lot of wide research into lore when setting up their version of the galaxy, but the canon reboot would take years before there were other works to pull from to flesh out new media, so it's not like they were going to just stop publishing anything until that got situated. And then they kind of just adapted whatever they had to work with at the time. But again, they were doing all this because they were trying to set up an interesting world that game masters could use for their tabletop campaign. And while this may be one of the biggest examples of that principle showing through, it extends to almost everything which gets published to some extent. I did a recent video about the Tapani sector, something that was introduced and fleshed out by West End Games sourcebooks. But even then, they weren't writing all of this to make some sort of consistent Star Wars backstory, and the form the lore takes is influenced by the purposes they were actually writing for. There were some comments about how unrealistic it was that the sector never changes over thousands of years, and then implying that the authors must be stupid for writing something like that. But the priority in writing the Tapani sourcebooks was never to do a realistic case study of what that portion of the galaxy might look like. It was instead to write it as a setting for a fantasy universe where they wanted that setting to be accessible no matter what era a game master may have wanted to set their campaign in. Sourcebooks like this, while being big wellsprings of fresh lore and great places to explore parts of the galaxy which don't get fleshed out in their dedicated stories, have to be understood in that context. And that kind of context will always inform the kind of content you get. In order to make things recognizable, a lot of Star Wars doesn't really change all that much over its history. But especially for regions primarily introduced and explored by tabletop RPG sourcebooks, they're always going to seem like some of the most unchanging parts of the galaxy. The Unknown Regions sourcebook wants you to be able to go there whether you are playing a KOTOR-era campaign or whether you're playing a Galactic Civil War-era campaign. So the Rakatan remnants have been there for thousands of years, almost unchanging, and we don't know exactly when a brave group of adventurers went out to find the mask of Darth Nihilus. None of this means you shouldn't want whatever it is you personally want out of Star Wars or any other media, it's just it always helps to understand where that media is coming from. And that sometimes the reason it doesn't align exactly with what your hopes would be isn't because everyone who made it was incompetent, it's just trying to do something else. That's going to do it for today though. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to the patrons and channel members whose support makes this channel possible.